everybody, welcome to the final video I'll do before the release of The Great Dark Beyond, which is happening tomorrow. So next time we're going to see content, it's actually going to be real gameplay, where I can use all the cards in Standard, unlike the Tavern Brawl where we could only use some from the last year. This video is going to be the most impactful cards, which is my really hand-wavy approach to what do I think are going to be the top 10 or so cards that are going to change the game in some way. It might not turn your deck into a tier 1 deck, but it might have a huge influence on the way that the class card will be played going forwards, or it'll create some new archetypes around it. First of all, I want to get some honourable mentions. Nexus Prince Jafar, Astral Vigilant, and the X-Star didn't actually make my top 10. Nexus Prince Jafar we're already seeing in Standard. It was one of the early release legendary cards, so we've been able to play with this for a few weeks now. And indeed, it has seen play in a rogue deck. And it's actually doing pretty well in that rogue deck as well. So I've not put it in my list because it was a bit unfair to put it into the list. Actually, I'm not sure it would have made the top 10 anyway. It would have been around that 10 mark. But I gave it an honourable mention instead, since we already know how it's doing. Astral Vigilant, a lot of the big legendaries in a lot of the classes are Draenei, and Astral Vigilant gives you back a copy of your last Draenei. So if your Draenei is really strong for you in your class, a bit like the Libram guy, who's a Draenei, whose name, literally as I just, Urel, right? As soon as I thought about it, it just emptied my mind. It just escaped gaseously through my ears. But yeah, Urel. You might want to get a Urel back to get you some more Librams from the past. You just drop an Astral Vigilant on the board, you get your Urel back. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the Tidepool minion, which got nerfed recently to 2 mana, which gave you a discover option of one of your last 3 spells cast. That card got nerfed. I don't know if Astral Vigilant is quite as powerful. I suspect it isn't, because Draenei is a narrower pool of cards and spells, but I think it's cut from a similar cloth, and I think it'll be a card that you'll see a lot of play in a lot of decks. Finally, the Exodar, which really probably should be making the top 10 list, and it would do if I thought any of the Starship decks were going to be particularly good. I don't think they're going to be that good, any of them. The best I think will be Druid, but I don't think Druid will really interact with Starships the way that most of the other classes will do. Like, they're not going to build this big beefy Starship. You're really just using it as like a combo type deck. Either way, I think if Starships do work, and actually the quality of the Starship decks is really going to come from the X-Star, the idea of launching the Starship, rather than spending 5 mana, you use it with the X-Star. The X-Star is then effectively a 3 mana 6/10. It's a pretty big tempo swing if you do that, so I think if any Starship deck does overperform what I'm expecting, it's going to be because of the X-Star. So for that reason, I think if I did the top 11, X-Star would have come in at 11, but sadly, we're doing 10. Alright, in at number 10, I have Lumia for Paladin. This card is disgusting. I see this as the big reset your health total card. It's like we're going to ignore the early game. We are now going to reset our health totals at around 6 mana crystals. And that is going to be really frustrating if you're playing an aggro deck, for example. You're racing down your opponent's face. They drop Lumia on the board. You can't use your big board of minions anymore to attack the face because only one of them can push their damage through, and normally these aggressive decks, they split their attack up thinner than some of the other decks. They don't normally go tall, they normally go wide, so this is like the big fuck you to aggro decks. There is currently a deck that's being played because of Renathal, which is like the Earthen XL Paladin deck. Renathal is going to drop out of the game tomorrow, I believe, when the new set comes out. And Lumia might just take the place. Obviously, you're going to have to cut the list down, and you're going to have to be more, narrow than that. But I can definitely see a world where there is this slower, more maybe mid-rangey Paladin deck that comes out. Maybe it's still Earthen Paladins as well. And they use Lumia just to stabilize the board. Drop it down on 6, try and get back up to 30 health with Lumia, which is not that unreasonable since it's a 6 mana 9/9. That is really hard for a lot of classes to remove. So yeah, I think this is a very solid card now. The real question is, do I think that this is actually going to work? My guess is no. I don't think there is a slow enough Paladin deck right now which is going to be good enough. I suspect it's going to have to be like Earthen or Highlander Paladin. That's probably going to be one of your 2 better options to put this in. And I don't think either will be tier 1 decks. But that being said, I think if you want to build one of these slow, more value-orientated Paladin decks, you really couldn't do that for some of the recent sets, even including when they gave you the Highlander card as well, which is really a value card. Paladin just doesn't have the tools to survive until the late game. They're now getting some of the tools to survive to the late game, so I think because of this reason that it could change the way Paladin decks are constructed going forwards, I had to put Lumia in my top 10. At 9, I have Eridar Brute, a neutral minion, 7 mana 5/6 demon with taunt lifesteal. More importantly, it costs 1 less for each enemy minion. We've seen in the last few sets a lot of very strong aggressive decks. I don't know what people would class as the tier 1 deck right now, but normally hovering around there has been some sort of like Nostalgia Shaman, some sort of Pirate Demon Hunter, generally speaking stuff that goes fairly quickly. What would you like to do if you're a deck that wants to play a bit slower? I'd like to put a big taunt minion in the way, and ideally put a big taunt minion in the way with lifesteal as well, and this is what Eridar Brute is. A lot of these aggro decks just don't have tools to remove big guys. This isn't obviously a ginormous guy, it's kind of a middling guy, but because of the fact that it costs 1 less for each enemy minion, your opponent is probably going to try and swarm the board with many tokens, which means you might be able to play your Eridar Brute for like 2 mana, and you could play another card on top of this. You might play 2 Eridar Brutes, for example, on the same turn. And for an aggro deck, that is just a nightmare. They're going to have to run multiple minions into this to kill it. It's basically going to reset you. Kind of the same way as Lumia for Paladin lets you get into the late game. I see this as Eridar Brute being a similar to Lumia effect. However, this is a neutral card. You can put it in any class, so I think this is a huge boon to any control deck lovers out there. I'm pretty certain if you're building a control deck going forwards, you're probably going to put Eridar Brute, or at least it's going to be a consideration. Other things to say that this card could actually perform well. Ziliax. Ziliax used to have a module, I think it's called Pylon module, that reduced the cost of the card by 1 for every, I think it was every minion on the board. That got nerfed to be 1 less for every friendly minion. Eridar Brute kind of is like what the unnerfed Ziliax was. Now this is for enemy minions, not your own minions, but kind of you're expecting if you're a control deck to be going up against more enemy minions. In which case Eridar Brute is going to get a pretty big discount and should be able to be played. And that Ziliax was good enough to see play in control decks to make sure you could live till the end game. So I think all signs point to Eridar Brute being pretty good as an anti-aggro tool. At 8 I have Murmur. There's not a lot to say about this, to be honest with you, with Murmur. Murmur is one that you're just going to have to watch out for in the future for Shaman. Shaman is always going to have this threat of an OTK deck out there that revolves around Battlecry minions, and the card that will enable this is Murmur. Now, you do have to be aware that Murmur, and I forgot to mention this when I did the star ratings, is an aura effect, so you can only get it when Murmur is on the field. So it kind of restricts you to 4 Battlecry cards a turn, since each Battlecry card costs 1 mana, and Shaman normally can't go beyond 10 mana crystals. So you're looking at, as soon as you hit turn 10, looking for some OTK combos. That's going to be the threat of Murmur going forwards. There is one right now that exists that I think is probably what most people will do. They will use the Incendious Shudder Block package to shuffle a ton of eruptions into your deck, and then cycle through your entire deck for the eruptions. The reason why this is pretty good with Murmur, rather than just doing it the way you do it right now, which is over 3 successive turns, is it's a pretty big tempo down to do this on 3 successive turns. Rather than you get it up 1 or 2 turns earlier if you do these 3 successive turn combos rather than Murmur. Rather than do that, just wait 2 more turns. Shaman is actually pretty good for control right now. They have a lot of good control options. And then you just do it all in 1 turn, and you take this 1 turn as like a tempo down turn, where you're really just getting 6 mana, 6/6 stats, but also putting the inevitability that you're going to win the game, because you're going to have 15 eruptions in your deck that do 3 damage each, I think. Or 2 damage each. Yeah, it's 2 damage each for Incendious. That is probably going to be GG, right? So, I think for the reason that it's fairly similar to what I think the Cycle Shaman deck is right now. Cycle Shaman isn't a tier 1 deck. I suspect that the Murmur version of it still won't be tier 1 deck. I still think it's going to be pretty annoying, like high tier 3, low tier 2. I think for those reasons, and for the reasons that I think you're always going to have to watch out for Murmur going forwards and what it could possibly do to the game, I had to slot this in the top 10. I've only put it in at 8. I think if there was a more immediate you're going to die combo in the game that didn't revolve around you playing elementals every single turn, which is the other alternative way of doing it, then I probably would have bumped it up at the list a bit more. So I've hedged my bets a bit. I've thrown it in at 8 instead. At 7 may be a surprise to some people. This is just a common card. It's Ethereal Oracle in the neutral package. 3 mana 2/3 spell damage +1 spell burst, draw 2 spells. I think this neutral card might see play in quite a lot of decks. It has a lot of stuff going for it. It tutors for spells, one of them. And tutors for 2 spells. It's 3 mana 2, 3 draw 2, sorry. That's incredible. That's really, really solid. Now, it does require you to spell burst it to get you the additional spells, but I expect you're going to play this in a deck with some sort of fairly cheap spell, even some sort of coin generator, for example, in which case this is like 3 mana 2, 3, draw 2 spells, discard a card, or discard a coin, or something like that, which is pretty strong. Also, the spell damage is not insignificant. If you're tutoring for spells, you're normally going to be running some sort of OTK spell damage type malarkey deck. You're going to draw some spells that do damage, in which case the spell damage is actually significant for this card. But I can see this playing decks which don't care about the spell damage at all. They simply just want to tutor for 2 spells. You might have 2 really important spells in your deck. Ethereal Oracle will get them. So I think for those reasons, this card is actually really, really solid as a neutral. I think it's going to see a lot of play in lots of places. So I've slotted it in at 7. At 6, I have Exarch Niall. Now, I think Exarch Niall will not see play in a tier 1 deck. I don't think Discover Hunter will be a tier 1 deck. However, what I do think going forwards for the next year is that Discover Hunter will always be a thing. It's a really fun idea for a deck to change your hero power to tracking. It gives Hunter some draw that it kind of would like to have some draw in Hunter. It's one of their weaknesses recently. They have this nice, really aggro package, but refilling after your aggression is pretty hard for Hunter compared to some of the other classes, especially since one of the good refills you could possibly do is something like Magatha, but a lot of the Hunter good aggro cards are actually spells that generate tokens, so you can't really run the two together. Exarch Niall turns your button into tracking. There are then some Discover card enablers out there as well. I don't think this deck will be a really fun deck, and I think it's going to be a different way to play Hunter than we've ever seen before in the game. So, for those reasons, I've slotted it in at 6. If I thought it'd be a tier 1 deck, I might have pushed it a bit higher, but I think, at the very best, this is going to be somewhere around the tier 2 region. It might even be tier 3, to be completely honest with you, but I certainly think this Discover Hunter... There's 3 decks, I think, from the get-go that people will try and play a lot of. Discover Hunter is one of them, which I think is going to be the fun option. I think Libram Paladin, which is going to be a bit of a nostalgia/fun option. And then I think people will try to OTK people with Quasar Rogue, because it just looks the most obnoxious to play against, and people like to play obnoxious decks from the get-go. So I see those as 3 of the decks that a lot of people will try early, and yeah, I think this will be a fun package. I'm looking forward to Hunter, to be honest with you. And I didn't play Hunter in Pip at all. It's the one class I didn't play in Pip. I just didn't really have any draw towards it. But now I have a draw, and it's because of Niall. Next at 5, and this might be a bit surprising to some people, the 8 Hands from Beyond from Death Knight. Now, I will say, my general feeling of this set has been that they've gave control players more tools to survive. And the idea, I think, is to try and push aggro down a little bit and pull control up, because control's really been in like this slightly awkward spot right now where they're not really that viable, control decks. Most the aggro decks can get underneath them, and then if you ever like go into another control matchup, normally there is some sort of filthy OTK type deck out there, and then you just lose to the combo deck instead. So control's been pretty rough going recently, especially at the higher ends of the game. I think if one class right now could make control work, though, it is Death Knight, and I think this 8 Hands from Beyond will go into the control Death Knight deck just as a tool to break combo deck players' hearts, which is kind of why I've put this in at 5, because classically the control deck loses to the combo deck because, you know, who cares if you're going later and later into the game? The combo deck normally wants to go later and later into the game. They want to get off this combo that does 30 damage to you and you just explode. Death Knight has some things going for it versus the combo decks though. They can get more than 30 health, which turns these OTK decks into maybe TTK decks, 2 or 3 turn kill decks. And that is not anywhere near as scary anymore, especially when the class has a lot of healing as well as gaining max health. Then they also have this card to just disrupt the combo, because many combo pieces are cheaper cards. Some of them are more expensive, but you're probably going to hit a combo piece if you destroy all but the 8 highest cost cards in the deck. So I think because of these reasons, the 8 Hands from Beyond has to go into these control Death Knight decks. And actually, I wouldn't be completely shocked that going forwards, if there ever existed some sort of other combo deck enabler out there, this 8 Hands from Beyond is always going to be this tech card to deal with the combo decks. So I think for those reasons, I had to slot this in at 5. I will say though, I don't think Control Death Knight will be a tier 1 deck. They just have a lot of good tools. Unlike some of the other classes, for example, they have Threads of Despair, which is such a good card to deal with early aggression. They have value generator cards in the form of the Headless Horseman. Kil'jaeden, as we're all going to see in a moment, because funnily enough it's in my top 10 list, also gives you this inevitability that you're going to win the game eventually, because you have a deck of infinite cards, which is pretty powerful. It's kind of the dream for Control decks. So I think Control is going to be stronger this set than the last set, but again, I don't think it'll quite get to tier 1. But I do think this is one of the cards that will push Control Death Knight above some of the other classes out there. Funnily enough, I just mentioned Kil'jaeden for a Control deck. Kil'jaeden I've thrown in at 4. Now, I will out the gate say that I don't think Kil'jaeden will be in a tier 1 deck, and I don't think any of the Control decks will be tier 1. And I think Kil'jaeden will almost exclusively be ran in Control decks. It's kind of like Dead Man Hand Warrior. This is kind of how I see Kil'jaeden. It may actually be one of the most impactful control cards ever printed. It's in that category, which is why it had to go into my top 10 list. One of the things that control decks have, I guess, an issue with when you go into the control matchup is that the greedier player will win. That's kind of how the control v control matchup always works. At least in my head, that's how I do it. You want to try and get as much value from your plays as is humanly possible to make the slight difference between you and your opponent. Kil'jaeden and like Dead Man Hand decks kind of just breaks that rule entirely, because you know that you have an inevitability that you're eventually going to get to a point in the game where you don't have to worry about fatigue. And that's kind of why this value v-value matchup is important in the control matchup, because at some point you're not going to kill your opponent's not going to kill you. However, there will be no cards in the deck left, and when you reach that point in the game, you'll start fatigue, and if you're in a state where your opponent has a minion and you don't, and you're fatiguing, you're going to die. Or if you've drawn more cards than your opponent, and you fatigue earlier, you're going to die faster. Kil'jaeden just stops that from happening. You don't have that concern anymore. You'll just turn your deck into demons, and the demons get stronger and stronger, so eventually you're going to run over your opponent's face if they don't have a Kil'jaeden. Now, here's where things get a little bit messy with Kil'jaeden, and why I don't think it's going to be necessarily be as good as like a Dead Man Hand Warrior, for example. It's still a pretty slow turn with Kil'jaeden. Firstly, you have to play a 7-mana 7/7, which is pretty hard in Hearthstone, to be completely honest with you. It's a pretty big tempo down. I will say control decks, especially, actually, not especially, just full on, the Highlander Warrior deck does find a way to play Bran as an 8-mana 2/4, right? In the double Battlecry Warrior deck. That deck, though, is pretty low down on the old tier ratings right now. I think it's around the tier 3 deck right now. Kil'jaeden is not quite as slow a tempo as that, but it's pretty hard going, right? 7-mana 7/7. Then, the demons that come out of the portal, you can easily get under these demons as well, for a few turns at the very least, because at the end of the day, you're just playing a card with a big stat line. And if you're a deck which can go swarmy, what is the big demons going to do? They can't really trade efficiently into your board. And actually, not a lot of the demons in Hearthstone right now have fast options. There are some exceptions to that, but most of them are pretty slow and pretty plodding, so I don't think as soon as you play Kil'jaeden and survive through the Kil'jaeden turn, do you just win the game with the endless portal of demons. I definitely think you can get beaten, and actually in the theory crafting stream there was one of the matchups, I can't remember who it was between, but both people were playing Control Warlock and both played Kil'jaeden, and the person that played Kil'jaeden second won the game because they had more cards in the hand to deal with their opponent's demons that they were summoning, and eventually they flung the tempo in their favor instead. Even though they were getting worse demons, arguably, because they had fewer stats than the opponent, they could just sneak under them, build a board, the opponent couldn't answer with the demons that they were generating, even though they were bigger, and they got out-tempoed, effectively, from Kil'jaeden. So, I don't think Kil'jaeden is this, you win the game when you play this as a control deck. It's just not that. But you're going to have to play in every single control deck, because if you play Control v Control and they have Kil'jaeden and you don't, you're going to lose the game, because they will just simply take the game out towards fatigue. That's all their focus should be. And then play Kil'jaeden and you will lose. So I think for these reasons that it's gonna have to be kind of be like a must run, I think, in control decks. Kil'jaeden had to go into like the top 5 or so cards for this set. It really drastically changes the way that control decks are gonna be formed going forward. And actually, I don't know how good control is in Wild. I suspect it's not very good at all. If, though, you're trying to make a control deck in Wild, you might want to put Kil'jaeden in your deck. If you can't put Dead Man's Hand in your deck because you're not a warrior, maybe Kil'jaeden is the alternative for the other classes, like the priests and the warlocks out there. Now we get into the top 3. Starlight Reactor from Druid. I think this is the only Starship deck that's going to be particularly good out of the get-go, and it's really not interacting with the Starship mechanic. It's really just because of the duplicating arcane spells, and more specifically, it's because of these 3 spells, but the top 2 in particular. Druid is pretty strong right now. They have a lot of ramping options, and I think you're going to be able to ramp fairly quickly to get towards around 8 mana crystals, where you could do something like Starlight Reactor, Distress Signal to get 4 minions on the board, and then play a Cosmic Phenomenon, fill your board with minions, and then start giving them all +1/+1 or +2/+2 to duplicate the effect. And I kind of foresee this as being similar to Drum Circle Druid, which was a very, very strong deck in the past. That it's just going to lead to this scenario where you're going to just generate this board state that your opponent, realistically at their mana cost, cannot ever deal with, and you will just win the game from there. That's kind of how I see Starlight Reactor. If they do survive through all of this, though, you then still have this ability to play Starlight Reactor plus Final Frontier to generate some big impactful cards, and 10 cost minions from the past typically are pretty good, and you get to discover one of them, so there are a lot of good options there. I see this as being some sort of like value deck, and I think it's going to be strong. I really do. I think it's also going to be one of the few situations where you're probably going to run Exodar in this deck, and you are going to use the Exodar to get more Starlight Reactors back so that you can build another Starship with multiple Starlight Reactors. Also worth noting, it's not just double it as well, it's recast it, so you can actually stack these Starlight Reactors in the Starship to get super arcane value. So Druid is one of the classes that can get into the late game faster, and they can probably make use of these big value cards better than opponents, because you play these big value cards earlier than your opponent can deal with them. So for those reasons, I think Starlight Reactor Druid or Arcane Druid is going to be a pretty strong deck. Also, it's something you're going to have to look out for going forward. Sorry, my English is just failing me right now. Druid, if they get printed any other arcane spells, Starlight Reactor is always going to work with it. I also like the way that they did this, by the way, because it could have quite easily done arcane spells that go to the face, in which case you would have had some sort of owl OTK possibility, but none of the arcane spells here go to the face. Therefore, it's very distinct from the spell damage Druid deck out there. Either way, Druid is eating so well right now. They have such a strong class right now, and I think this is going to be another strong deck. I think it'll be around this tier 2, maybe even pushing tier 1 region. So yeah, I look forward to seeing what this deck does. In at number 2 is Blazing Accretion from Mage. It's 3 mana, 3/1, draw 3 cards. We can move on. That is so unbelievably mental, because obviously in your Fire Elemental Mage deck, you're only going to put fire spells, you're only going to put elementals in your deck. This will never miss. 3 mana, 3/1, draw 3! It's so strong! It's crazy! Do you know how much it normally costs to draw 3 cards? I mean, normally you're paying like 3 mana for it, which effectively means this is a 0 mana 3/1. You're probably going to be playing this in some sort of vaguely aggressive deck. It's started very aggressively as well with a 3/1 stat line. This card is disgusting. If Fire Elemental is going to work, as much as, people say, it's Sauron that makes it work, I think it's actually this card that will make it work. This is just such an unbelievable refill. I talked earlier about that there are some good aggro Hunter decks out there, but they struggle to refill. Imagine if aggro Hunter had 3 mana 3/1, draw 3. That would be a strong deck. So yeah, Blazing Accretion's a monumental card for that archetype. I think it wouldn't work without it, so for that reason, and I think this deck actually could go to tier 1. We saw it in the Theory Crafting stream that it does do potentially some really disgusting things. And I love that it flips its switch as well. Like, you're like, I'm standard Elemental Mage. I'm a tempo deck and playing a bunch of minions. I've got a big board, right? And suddenly your opponent's like, haha, I've locked the board down. What are you going to do now, Elemental Mage? And it's like, okay, we have the fire spells now. And then they just plink, plink, plink you down from the last little bit of your health remaining. I really think this is going to be a scary deck. I think it's going to be very explosive. I think this is going to be a pretty strong candidate as well for an early tier 1 deck. For those reasons, I'm going to put this in at 2. Finally, and this might not be a surprise to you if you've watched my star ratings, Quasar. I think Quasar is going to be the deck that people try and get going from the opening of the set. They're going to all try and get these sweaty rogue decks going where you're going to play Quasar. It's going to reduce the cost of every card in your deck by 3, which will take every card but the other Quasar to 0. And you will play your entire deck and try and OTK your opponent with your entire deck. The balance will be between making sure you have enough damage to kill your opponent and being able to draw your entire deck with or after you've played the Quasar, because obviously shuffling your hand into your deck is a pretty brutal condition for activating an effect. Now, fortunately, Rogue has stuff like Knick Knack Shack, for example, which is also a card that costs 3 or less, so if you draw another Knick Knack Shack, then you're honestly completely, like, fine from there. Rogue also has a couple of weapons, like Quick Pick, that let you draw on top of the weapon. And there's going to be a ton of cards that you just put into that deck, which will say draw 2 or 3 cards. There's even stuff like, you know, shuffle 2 cards into your deck and then draw 3. What a great card to top deck after you've played Quasar. It just turns into draw 3 cards, and then you get Motoring. So there's going to be this balance between having enough damage in the deck, having enough draw in the deck, and actually the third thing you're going to have to balance is surviving until you play Quasar. But we have seen fairly recently that Rogue had an infinite Rogue deck with Tidepool Hunter. I can't remember what the other cards in that infinite Rogue deck either was. It was like Sonya and stuff like that, and you could create an infinite combo where you would eventually machine gun your opponents down with spell damage. I kind of see the same backbone of that deck being in the Quasar Rogue deck, where you're going to use stuff like Tarslicks, and you're going to use stuff like Fan of Knives just to try and deal with any board presence out there. Because as soon as you get the Quasar turn going, you're probably going to win the game. That's my expectation. So for those reasons, and I think that this is going to be the closest thing we've had to a Miracle Rogue since the last Miracle Rogue deck, I think we had to put this at tier 1. It's going to be, I think it will be a tier 1 deck. I think it's going to be a strong archetype. I think it's going to be a fairly new archetype, at least for recent Rogue decks. And I definitely can see a world where Quasar gets nerfed if it becomes really, really obnoxious. Anyway, that is my 10 most impactful cards. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you're looking forward to. And I will see you tomorrow for streams at twitch.tv/Andalono, where we'll play some of the new decks. Bye-bye.